I was looking up where the name Ku Klux Klan comes from. Do you know?
It sounds so exotic. Foreign language, right? Must be something wonderful. Ku Klux Klan.
Well, apparently there's two different ideas about where it came from, and one of them is that it's the sound of a rifle cocking.
Oh, why?
Although having never owned or handled a rifle, I couldn't vouch for how accurate that noise is. Have you ever fired a rifle?
No.
Right. You had to pause there. You had to think.
I did, because I think one time I fired a handgun.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Obviously, it's like there for a moment there you were mentally calculating sniper rifle. Does that count or not? Or if it's a submachine gun, maybe that doesn't count. So anyway, that's one idea about where Ku Klux Klan comes from. Otherwise, it's from the Greek word kaiklos, which means circle.
Circle.
Don't really get that. Not sure what's circular about the Ku Klux Klan.
Well, it sounds a little bit like Cyclops, like the eye, and then of course the Ku Klux Klan had those the holes in the sheets that were part of the hood.
But they cut two holes, don't they? They should have just cut one. They should have just cut one hole.
I think so.
It's like such an idiotic thing to call your ultra right-wing organisation. I was thinking, well, if that was the case, the Nazis would have to call themselves the March Salute Gang, something like that. The kind of the stamp goose step parade. That's what their name would be. I don't think any of it's
supposed to make much sense.
Hello and welcome to the Two Real Cinema Club. I am James Rosica.
And I am Andres Lorente. And at the Two Real Cinema Club, we look at a new film, or newish. Sometimes we're a little bit behind the times. And then we also look at an old film and we draw conclusions. We make connections. We do a lot of marvelous things with just two films as our resources.
We scrape the barrel, is what you mean. We're absolutely wringing the very last drops out of the gin rag. We've just done two podcasts about Nazis, so I'm glad to say this week we are moving on to something a bit lighter. No, we're not. No, we're doing the Ku Klux Klan this week and the Nazis again. Great. Welcome to the Two Real Cinema Nazi Club podcast where we talk about films about the most objectionable people who ever lived. 90 minutes of light-hearted fun and whimsy coming your way. Oof. I miss the days when we used to be the Two Real Donkey Club film.
And that was about this time last year. But
yeah, we covered all the donkey films. Not anymore.
No, well, I'm rooting for the donkeys now because, boy, we've been dealing with some evil characters of late. And that's saying a lot because I didn't really like those donkey films too much, as you remember. So.
But they were a bit lighter than what we've been watching lately.
What did we watch? Remind people.
We have watched Origin, which is the newish Ava DuVernay film about the history of racism. And then we are comparing it to 1915's, I use the word classic advisedly, Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffiths, a film that made the Ku Klux Klan look good. So a whole load of appalling racist violence to wade through this week. What a lot of fun. But before we talk about that, we have mail.
You got mail.
Insofar as we have mail this week because James Holcomb has written on our YouTube channel following last week's Hogan's Heroes mention in the We Did Not See That Coming podcast. He pointed out that Hogan's Heroes apparently was based loosely on Stalag 17, the movie. Have you seen that?
No.
No, I have. Apparently, it's Billy Wilder, 1953, William Holden, Otto Preminger.
Wow.
And Holden won the Best Actor Oscar for it. So, put it on the list. I've never seen that, never even heard of it. I've did a bit of research. It turns out that I have seen the Ripping Yarns parody of it, from which is like a British comedy show that Michael Palin made in 1978.
Wow.
Called Escape from Stalag Luft 11B. So I've seen that, but not the original.
In Stalag 17, that's an historical place where POWs were kept, I suppose. Huh?
I guess. Clearly, in 1953, it seemed like a reasonable target for a comedy picture. Though this is 8 years after the end of the Second World War. People moved fast in those days, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, they moved fast in 1915, too. I was surprised that Birth of a Nation was filmed in about 3 or 4 months, something like that, which is just mind-boggling. So maybe we're moving slower. It sort of shows in the old films. You always think, oh, boy, they're playing at the wrong speed, or everyone was really hyper. There was more coffee. Oh, there was cocaine in the Coca-Cola. That's what
People were just more energetic back then.
Yeah, a lot of energy.
Should we talk about the first film?
I think we should.
So this is your recommendation. You saw it about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I think. Is that right? And then you've watched it again this week?
I watched it again this week. I saw it January 26 or 27, so almost 2 months ago. It seems to me like it was in the theaters at some point in 2023, but I also felt like that was definitely the first run or the first showing in this area. So this would have been on the 2023 Oscars list or possibilities anyway, but I don't think it got much love.
I don't think it got any plaudits. No, it didn't. So I was just kind of surprises me. So it's directed by Ava DuVernay, whose catalogue I'm not super familiar with. She made I Will Follow, not seen it. Middle of Nowhere, not seen it. Selma, not seen it. A Wrinkle in Time, which I have, but it wasn't very good.
Yeah.
13th, a documentary about incarceration in the US. She's made all these pictures. I'm not really very up on her filmography. I think you've seen more, am I right?
Seen Selma, and I've seen the 13th, which is excellent. That's a documentary about the 13th Amendment, and boy, relevant for our discussion today, but also just a really good documentary. So I would definitely recommend that. I haven't seen the other ones you mentioned, though.
Okay, fine. So I don't feel quite so bad. So I have something to say about this film before I go through the synopsis, but then we'll talk about it in a normal way. But my initial comment is, I know how much you liked this film, and I always want to doff my hat. The way this podcast works is that you provide the intelligent, academic, sensible opinions, and I come in with the idiocy. I know that you liked this film, and I am really sorry to say that I kind of didn't like it that much.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
But so we can come to blows later.
Yeah.
But I got to the end, and I think I'm going to compare this film to George W. Bush.
Ooh.
Because when George W. Bush was president, which is like 2000, 2008, is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think to most Europeans, George W. Bush kind of looked like a bit of an idiot, and he seems to us like someone who couldn't string a sentence together. But to Americans, even like to Americans I spoke to who didn't like him and didn't agree with him and didn't vote for him, most Americans I would speak to would tell me that whatever you thought of George W. Bush, he was statesmanlike, he had gravitas and charm, and he had the kind of personality that inspired faith. This was the kind of president you want to have a beer with. And to Europeans, that attitude just seemed kind of ludicrous and difficult to pass. And I think this film is similar insofar as I think this is a film that looks different depending on which side of the Atlantic you are standing on.
Ooh, nice.
So I was standing on the European side, and I saw a few things that slightly grated with me, although there's a lot of good material here as well, so I'm not going to be a complete downer on it. But I apologize in advance. And I have kind of split the film sort of into two things. I think there are two things to discuss. One is about the content of the film, and one is about the way that the film has been made. So maybe we'll split our discussion into those two. Yeah.
No need to apologize. I think apparently the American public feels similarly because this film has grossed $5 million on a $38 million budget.
Okay, that is interesting. All right.
I might be the outlier on this one, but yeah, let's hear the synopsis and hear your take for sure.
So, Origin, for people who don't know, so it is a 2023, I've called it a docudrama. Do you think that's sort of fair?
That's pretty accurate. So I've seen it called a biopic, which is not. So yeah, docudrama is good.
Yeah, so it's a docudrama about racism and prejudice. And it opens up just with a statement on the screen that tells you we're going to be watching a semi-fictional retelling of the story of Isabel Wilkerson, who is a non-fiction writer in the US, researching and writing her book, Caste. So the book was published in 2020. It was a big seller in the US. It was kind of on the bestseller list for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. It was in Oprah's book club, all of that. Big hit book about racism and prejudice. And the film tells us that we're going to kind of watch like a sort of reconstruction of her act of writing and researching the book. And then after that, we get our opening image. So I do pay attention to what you say. We get an opening image. It starts with a street light at night, and some leaves and some trees. And immediately I saw that and I was thinking, is it trying to establish what this film is trying to be a light in the darkness, something like that? I don't know. Yeah. But, the camera kind of pulls focus. We are following a young man as he goes to the convenience store, buys some snacks. He's talking on his phone to his girlfriend. And then after a minute, he tells her, I think there's a guy in a car following me. And it turns out that this lad is Trayvon Martin. Who I think even in the UK, people are aware he was a 17-year-old boy who was kind of murdered vigilante style by a guy. I don't know where in the US it happened. Do you know where that happened?
It happened in Florida. Yep.
Florida. Okay, right, okay. So that's how the film opens. Then we cut to Isabel Wilkerson, kind of herself. I mean, she's played by Anjuani Ellis-Taylor, and I apologise to her if I've mispronounced her name.
I think it's a fancy way of spelling ingenue.
Ingenue. Oh, man, see, I should have known that. Oh, thank God you're on the podcast.
Alternative way of spelling it, I should say.
Thank you. You can reach down the wires and give me a clip round the ear. Okay, thank you. So she's giving a speech to, some people who've come to hear a lecture. I don't know. She has a name on the screen behind her. She's won a Pulitzer Prize. After the speech, she strolls backstage. Her commissioning editor grabs her and he says, I want you to write a piece on Trayvon Martin. And she says kind of, no, I'm not going to. And in this little conversation, I think it's mentioned at least 3 times that she has won a Pulitzer Prize. It's like a refusing the call sort of moment for the film.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. It's that kind of structural element. The editor emails her an MP3 of the recording of the 911 call from Trayvon Martin's shooting. So at least she listens to it. We, the audience, have to watch the poor boy get shot in close up right on screen in front of us. And so Isabel decides, well, no, I'm not going to write this story about this lad, but I am going to kind of sort of use this as a starting off point to come up with a unified theory of prejudice. I think that's kind of what she's going for. She has this early idea in the film that there is a kind of some unifying idea which may tie together all the prejudice that she and other people encounter in the world. And then she spends the rest of the film basically looking for evidence for this idea. So we watch her as she goes to Germany. We watch her as she goes to India. She finds that the Jim Crow laws share a lot in common with Nazism, with the Indian notion of caste. She meets a lot of people. She hears a lot of anecdotes. And the film that results from all this traveling and meeting, to me, feels scattershot. I was trying to think of an analogy. It feels like she was doing lots of research for the book, and then as she was heading to Starbucks to kind of sit down and write up all the research, she dropped the box of index cards that she'd written her notes on, and then she's gathered them all up, put them back in the box, and then she wrote the book in the order that the cards were randomly put back in the box. It all feels kind of a little bit scattershot and a little bit sort of first this, then this, then this, then this, then this, then this over there. I'm going to ring the spoiler bell in a second, but anything to say before I do?
Sounds like Rain Man style. Everything fell on the floor, and then she was able to put it back together into the box. And
well, she said 437 cards, just like that.
I think towards the last 15 or 20 minutes of the film sort of try to make sense of all of that, right? I think, when she's writing the book, she's putting up the pillars and she sort of organizes it. I think that she's taking a lot of disorder and a lot of things that have been misunderstood. And I think that her confusion is intentional. And then all of a sudden she's able to synthesize it. That comes up again in the end because she talks about, I'm looking for the connective tissue here. I'm looking for how these things interconnect, because she knows they do. And it's a hard struggle. And that's part of the story, is trying to get through the confusion, get through the hundreds of years of misinformation, and put it all together in a coherent way, which her cousin tells her to do again and again. So it's interesting because she's getting a lot of advice along the way, and it's a very big project at a really difficult time in her life. So that makes sense to me. But yes, ring the spoiler bell. I don't think I spoiled anything too much just now.
Okay, I'll just... Yeah. Here's the bell. So the spoiler is, as you have alluded to, she has a series of personal tragedies of her own. So her mother, who is going into care at the beginning of the film, then dies, and then her husband dies.
I think it's the reverse order, though.
Is that right? The husband dies first. Oof, right, okay.
That's okay.
And then, so we get some, what I think is personally some fairly superficial exploration of grief and life changes, insofar as we have like a number of scenes of this is going to sound disrespectful, I'm sorry, but I don't think this film handled it particularly well. I see her make the sad face. Basically, we have her making the sad face for a bit, and then her mother dies, and she makes the sad face, and we get some cutaways to Isabel kind of lying in a pile of autumn leaves, making a sad face. I wasn't a big fan of. I wasn't a big fan of the way that this kind of grief is handled, because I thought it could be a little bit more nuanced and clever. And I'm not a big fan of the performance of Isabel Wilkerson's character as a whole. I kind of think there's, I don't know, most writers I know are garrulous and funny and witty and good company. I'm sure the real Isabel Wilkerson is all of those things as well. But in this film, I came to the end asking, why is this a docudrama instead of just a documentary? Because I honestly don't think she is a particularly interesting character. And I think following the journey of her having these hardships and then interviewing people is not nearly as interesting as the material that she uncovers from these interviews.
Yeah.
I feel like this would have been a better sort of film, a little bit like The Inconvenient Truth or a Michael Moore style film, rather than the drama the shape that it takes.
I was going to say that I heard an interview with Ava DuVernay and with the New Yorker Radio Hour, and apparently Isabel Wilkerson is super private. This is way outside of her comfort zone. So she's actually not garrulous. She's not that outgoing. She just likes to, at the New York Times, I think she just likes to sit in her cubicle and write. So she's actually very, very private. And I think that part, playing her in the film, is really complicated, because you're right. It's docudrama. It's like you're trying to play the person almost in a documentary at the same time you're playing them in sort of a narrative film. So I think it's super challenging. I think it is kind of outside everyone's comfort zone, but I think that's the baseline of this film, is you're not supposed to be comfortable. So I was okay with that. And I think it actually is a pretty good performance, in the sense that you have to balance, like, how real is it? I hate they call it a semi-fictional portrayal, because that seems like a cop-out. Like, I agree with you in the sense that in terms of the intellectual elements of this film, a documentary is essential, and maybe that's forthcoming. But also, DuVernay said she had, I think there are 2 books that Wilkerson wrote, and David Remnick, who interviewed her, said, why didn't you choose the other book? Because apparently the other book is more appropriate for a narrative film, and this book is less appropriate. And I think it's quite an achievement, whether it's successful or not. It's quite an achievement to turn it into that. And the thing that I like about this film, but obviously it hasn't worked for the public, is that it is, it's kind of a broad film. It should have a very broad audience. It's not written in a super intellectual way. It's not written in a super dramatic way, I guess. And that's probably just too difficult a balance to strike. But it's available to everyone. And in that interview, she even said, look, I know a lot of people are just going to be watching this on a cell phone. So as a result, it's not a super cinematic film. There are a couple of money shots or money sequences, but I think at times it almost verges on this sort of very made for streaming, almost made for television feel. And I think it's because she wants a broad audience. So I think a lot of this is intentional, and I think it's a tricky balance to strike, but I applaud her, because I think it's pretty well done. But continue.
Well, I think you've already kind of alluded to the last sort of 20 minutes, or maybe kind of the last half hour. So I think that is where the film really kicks into gear for me. So there's like a kind of half-hour lecture or summing up at the end of the movie, where she's talking about, just like you said, she's drawing her research together. She's describing what she calls the 8 pillars of caste, which is, feels like a reference to the 7 pillars of Islam, I suppose, about this idea of these 8 basic notions about how people are controlled and how their lives are set in stone, or at least forced onto the railway tracks. And then this sort of semi-lecture is she reads it to us against a backdrop of recreations of various events. So we see people who are trapped in slave ships. We see a lynching. We see a murder at a Nazi concentration camp. That section of the film, I think, is all very effective. I think it works. There's some very effective imagery there. Cleverly, there's this nice bit they draw parallels between the swastika and the Confederate flag. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's work there that that really works. And I sort of feel like that final half hour is kind of the promise of what the film could have, should be. That was the film that I think I was sort of expecting, and that's the film I think that really works. But I think the previous sort of hour and 3/4 of kind of semi-biopic is interesting what you say about her life, because she doesn't strike me as the right subject for a biopic.
Yeah, I think she would agree. And I think Ava DuVernay would agree too. So.
Right. So maybe it's just kind of, it's a brave idea, and you've done your best with it. But I think maybe one should think again and approach the material in a different way. At the very end of the movie, she makes what I think is like probably the most famous comment or quote from the book. She says that this kind of very cute analogy. She says that society is like a house.
Yeah.
And although we weren't here when the house was built, and we didn't lay the bricks and we didn't dig the foundations, we are the people who own it now. And so it's up to us to do the maintenance and make the house livable. So, I really like that metaphor. It's great. It's a nice bit of writing, and well done. And then I think the film kind of slightly fluffs it, because then during the film, she has been kind of renovating her late mother's old house. And in the film, she walks out of the house and she walks past some of the actors who played some of the characters in the retelling and in the recreations of earlier scenes. And this kind of ending of the film, which is supposed to kind of bookend the film, I'm afraid I found that left me going out on a cringe.
Yeah.
At the very end, the last person she walks past is Trayvon Martin, or the actor who's playing Trayvon Martin. And Trayvon Martin gives her this look like kind of, yeah, you solved racism. Well done. That just made me kind of cringe so badly. I felt like this is like the wrong note to end on. So it kind of left me at the end of the film really feeling like that was a terrible misfire.
Yeah.
I felt like there were a bunch of interesting films that this story manages to skate past a number. It feels like a series of missed opportunities. So I would be very interested to see a film about Trayvon Martin.
Yeah.
But in this case, he kind of feels a little bit like a symbol who gets used, rather than he's not really treated as a real person with an actual life or a motivation or a background or a story. And he's just like this kind of symbol who's tossed in at the beginning of the film, and then he reappears at the end, given the thumbs up. There are a couple of anthropologists. In fact, there's these two couples who are anthropologists who go to the Deep South in the 1930s, and they do some research. And they turn up on the lawn at the end of the movie, on the outside the house. And I thought it would be interesting to see what their story is, but we don't really investigate too deeply what they discover or what their lives were like. They're just sort of people who are thrown in for a little bit more background detail. There are a whole bunch of missed opportunities, I thought, in this film. So I came away feeling very unsatisfied. And after all that, I apologise. I wish I'd liked it more. I wish I thought it was better. I felt like they missed the mark. Sorry.
Yeah, I would say never apologise. That's very important to see a film.
I'm sorry for apologising. I apologise.
That's better. You have to apologise for apologising. I like that. I think I agree with you on the ending seemed a little too pat. You're right. But I think the point was, at the beginning you see that light in the darkness, and you see minutes after that, you basically see the horrible event of Trayvon Martin's life. But I think at the end you see Trayvon Martin exactly where he should be, which is alive. And that's kind of that's the whole sense of this film, is that she's sort of she's not solving caste. And I think she really does dwell on this difference between racism and caste, and I think that's fundamental. But I think what she does is she is able to at least pose a theory on why he dies, and it's a very strange incident, because George Zimmerman, who killed Trayvon Martin, I think his mother was Latino. His last name was Zimmerman, so I think his mother's Latino, and she poses this question: why is like a Latino or a mixed race man deputizing himself to protect a white neighborhood in Florida and just killing without any reason whatsoever. He's killing an innocent young man. And she's able to explain how caste played into the whole incident. So I think it's kind of the proper ending. I from her other films, I've seen that she definitely has these sort of, again, these like broad stroke. That's what the average American film goer wants, I think, is this sort of pat ending. It's kind of nice. You get to see the characters' smiling faces and all that. And she's concluded her story. So I agree with you. I think it's not really quite the best ending. And I also agree with you that I think that a documentary about the book, which I hope is coming in some form or another, would probably be a better explanation of her work and her thoughts.
Shall I tell you about the book? Because to show off, I did read the book. I read the book.
You always do. I'm hoping you read The Klansman too, but we'll get to that in the next film, I suppose.
No, sadly not. It's not a small book. I read the Kindle version.
Yep.
Amazon says that it's 544 pages. I think the Kindle version is like 470 pages or something. So I don't know where Amazon is getting their page count. And the last 28% is footnotes. So I read like 350 pages, something like that. And I must say, I think it's a very good 180-page book that has been padded out, I think.
Okay.
There are, to me, there are long sections where it feels like someone has leant over her shoulder and told her, "Can we make this a bit longer, please? You just need to reach this word count to be eligible for something or other."
Yeah.
So I feel like there are some sections that are just full of page after page of waffle. I mean, clearly I could tell from the book, which I read before seeing the film, that she had been doing some work on a house, because there are lots and lots of house construction metaphors.
Yeah.
And she kind of goes on and on and on about this kind of house thing. And the way that it's summarized up at the end of the film is neat, but it goes on and on and on in the book. And she kind of, she often talks about how, like, the cast of a play and the cast that you put on a broken arm, and caste meaning, racial prejudice, all have parallel meanings. I kind of think, this feels a little bit like someone who's, trying to reach a word count. You're just kind of stringing it out. And it, like I was saying before, it's quite scattershot. I started to make some notes that, like, there's one chapter where she starts out talking about a white guy who kills his wife, and then kind of invents a person of color to tell to the police report, to blame. And then she moves on to a bit about a white terrorist, and then she moves on to an Ebola outbreak in Africa. And these things then make up this one chapter. And I got to the end of the chapter and I think these things are not really related. Why are they all in a chapter together? There's a chapter about dog behavior. There's kind of lots of stuff where I kind of think, I'm not sure those things belong together. There's some great sections, but I think the book needs an editor, and it just bounces around way too much. I think it would have been more effective if she had kind of kept to the point and gone for half the page count.
Yeah.
She has this kind of persistent thesis, which I'm still not sure, having seen the film and having read the book, that I kind of agree with. This notion that kind of all the things that we talk about as racism or prejudice are somehow kind of unified by this single idea, and I'm not completely sure that they are. So we have a book where she talks about. So she says, like, the Holocaust of World War II and the 246 years of slavery in America are kind of the same things, but also there are these anecdotes about when with like an airline steward who was a bit snooty to her in first class. And I'm not saying, oh, get over yourself. I fully recognize this kind of microaggression. Those sorts of things wear you down, and they're real and they're significant. And I absolutely believe her. People are racist in all sorts of different ways. Yeah. But if I was writing a book about the Holocaust and slavery, I probably just wouldn't put in the anecdote about people being snooty on an aeroplane, because I feel a little bit like it diminishes the big picture. I kind of think, put that in another book. That's something that deserves a book, but I don't know if it belongs in this book. Yeah. The best things in the book are all in the film. I'll tell you that.
Oh, that's good. Okay.
So having seen the film, I think you've seen the best of the bits of the book.
Well, I think I would just refer back to about making bigger ideas palatable for a less curious audience, I guess. And I think that's a challenge here. And I love it when her cousin has her repeat some ideas in layperson's language. I think that sort of sums it up. Like, I think she's got some pretty good ideas, and I think the point of the film is to try and get them to a digestible quality for just any viewer. And even just that idea of being able to look at it on streaming and phones and all that, she's just really anticipating that this is something that a lot of people need to see. So it has to be presented in a fairly commercial way. But at the same time, there's a lot of intellectual stuff in here. And it sounds like the film sort of does what the book does in terms of like padding it with extra material. I think one thing that really works for me quite well in the film is the metaphors. They're very broad and they're not super original, but the house metaphor sounds like it's overdone in the book. It's a touch overdone in the film, I think, but it's a great way of explaining, how we continue to deal with caste. I think that's done pretty well. There's a lot in the film about memory and her mother's memory and how we need to remember stuff, but it's not always very clear. And we're working with sort of unreliable sources for our current understanding of history. I think that's another pretty good subplot. The other subplot is her personal life, and I think maybe that might be a mistake. That might be a bad decision or a questionable decision in the filmmaking because she is super personal. She's not an outgoing person. She's not like your classic protagonist for a film. But the things that she went through personally are intense in the writing of this book. The deaths in the family, the death of a cousin, a mother, her husband, all within a few years' time. But I think you're right. Like going on to, taking one instance on an airplane is not a great fodder for like a larger theme and a thesis about the history of the world. I think the idea is that there's a permission structure there because of caste. Maybe an airline stewardess has this power to treat certain people differently. So I think that's probably why she has those moments in there. But it's riding the line between something that's academic and something that's going to be popular and commercially palatable, which is a really fine line. So I mean, I think we saw American Fiction recently, which I think does a better job of that in some ways. And it's also just far more entertaining. But I found a lot of this film very moving, and I thought that the metaphors throughout were pretty well used. And then there's some big scenes in here too that I would talk about a little bit with you if you'd like. The theme statement comes a theme statement comes quite late when she's trying to sell the house. She's getting an estate agent to give an idea of what the house might be worth or what needs to be done. And the estate agent at one point just says, let someone else do the work. That's an option. She could either paint and repair the ceiling herself, or she could let someone else do the work, which is basically what has been happening for centuries. So I think that, that metaphor definitely, rings true. I mean, that whole idea of the house is a pretty good metaphor. And again, it's kind of broad in terms of everyone can accept, I can envision this metaphor of us all having this house that we're supposed to take care of, even though we've inherited and such. There's a great metaphor in India where this Dalit leader who worked on the Constitution has his statues all over the country, but they're in cages because people would deface them and vandalize them. And I just thought, boy, huge metaphor. So I think part of the process is that you've got this woman's life and all she's experiencing and writing about, and so many of these things are just beautifully cinematic on one level, but also academic on another. And I think, again, hard balance to sort of navigate. But for me, I think you're right about the last 20 or 30 minutes. I counted, she says to her editor, 6 or 7 pillars. I counted 6 when she's working on the whiteboard, but who knows how many there really are. But she really does kind of spell it all out. So it's this wonderful journey of her just being confused and trying to put it together and people questioning her all along. And I think that's some of those questions that others ask of her are pretty pointed and important to discuss. But she kind of gets down to these 2, as you said, recreations of a very difficult scene where a Dalit man in India is cleaning a public toilet using his own body, basically. And wow. And that falls under one of her pillars in terms of like occupational hierarchy maintains caste in the world. She talked about controlling marriage, like like controlling certain bloodlines, because otherwise you can't characterize one people as being lesser than another unless they're kind of unified by blood. Terror and cruelty is one of her pillars. Inherent superiority, just telling people that they are lesser than others. And this purity versus pollution. I mean, a lot of her pillars kind of, I think, intertwine a little bit, so it's not the cleanest thing for me, but it's very telling that the Nazis, and there's a great documentary series here in the United States, Ken Burns did it, it's called The U.S. and the Holocaust. So the Nazis really did take the entire idea of segregating Jews and incarcerating them and executing them sort of from the genocide against the American Indian, but more so against the entire segregation and of slavery and everything that we've done to the Africans who came here, 250 years were enslaved. So they take that plan of segregating and by law making them lesser and inferior. So that's a really interesting theory that a lot of Americans don't know about. And that's why, to a certain extent, I find this sort of critical viewing for a lot of Americans who've never thought of this. They've got a chance to go see a movie that kind of it makes it simpler for them to digest. And I'm sad that, more people are not seeing it, because I do think of it as critical viewing for the average American. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, interesting you mentioned American fiction, because one of the things I wrote in my notes here was this film is the stupid version of American fiction, which is, that's a bit unfair.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think I was running out of patience at that point, but I sort of think, in a way, we're sort of on the same page there. Another note I wrote, which is, I think Kindred, which is the Octavia Butler book, which I think we might have discussed before when we talked about Afrofuturism. I think Kindred did this better. But Kindred is a pretty outstanding book. Yeah. Interestingly, I was kind of saying that a lot of the good material from the book is in the film. The story about the kid who can't go to the swimming pool with the other kids in his baseball team, that's a pivotal chapter in the book. The story about the girl who was given the first name Miss, so that people would have to sound respectful when they addressed her. That's lifted straight from the book. Those things, I think, work really well. What is missing from the film, which is actually quite prominent in the book, she does talk quite a lot about Obama and about Trump. And there's kind of no mention of either of those at all right now. And in a way, that's a little bit surprising, because I feel if you're going to release a movie in 2023, 2024, maybe having some discussion of Obama and Trump, perhaps that's not a bad idea to bring up those talking points right now. Definitely.
That is absent from the film. I think there's a little mention of Obama at one point.
Is there? Okay.
But not much, yeah. The swimming pool scene, I think, deserves a little nod, because it goes back to her mother's memory. Her mother's telling this story about a championship little league team. They've played a baseball series, they've won something, and they celebrate in a swimming pool. And the Isabel character thinks her mother's just sort of a little demented, old. She's not remembering something very clearly. And then she finds this article when she's cleaning up the house, metaphor after metaphor, of course. And it's true that there was one black boy on this little league team. They went to celebrate in that pool, at that pool party, and he couldn't go into the pool because the pool would have to be cleaned afterwards. So he had to sit outside, and it's a very hot day. He's outside the fence watching. And then these 8-year-old boys, 9-year-old boys were wondering why they can't, swim with their friend. So the organizer of the park, the manager of the park, pulls everybody out of the pool, and it's an intense scene because they let him be escorted around on a little float. He does sort of a circumnavigation with this lifeguard pulling him, and he is so uncomfortable. He's told not to touch the water. It's traumatic for the viewer, but more importantly, it's traumatic for the young boy. And it couldn't have been, this reward that they thought they were giving him. And you just realize they were the whites all around him were doing that for themselves. They weren't really doing it for him. It was not an enjoyable experience, but it sort of made them feel a little bit better by providing some measure of equality for him. But you can see that he's traumatized in it. And Wilkerson makes that point in, her voiceover of how, that was something like a little bit of him died that day. And he went on to be, I guess, an art professor and a successful person and all that. But a lot of the kids, I think, were traumatized. And it's this idea that those adult parents weren't passing on this message of equality. On the contrary, they're passing on either the caste structure or the racist structure that they grew up with, and it's going generation to generation. And I think it links really well with an intense scene in Germany when there's a woman who's questioning her thesis, and she's forcing Wilkerson to think more about this idea. And she says, well, it's really nothing compared to what we went through here in Germany with the Nazis. And, now, swastikas are against the law. You can't fly the flag and whatnot. And how much, and she's just sort of questioning how real the slavery caste idea is. And I think the thing that gets left out there is I think the whole Nazi experience is intense because it happens within 20 years at most. And it's sort of one generation of people that buy into it and really, really believe it and execute it, right? And I think, obviously there's still Nazis out there today, but I think the thing about the American problem is it was 250 years. So and she mentions it's 13 generations of people perpetuating this cruelty. It leads to just as many, if not more deaths. We don't even know. But I think, as humans, we understand things that happen in our lifetimes or that are really short. We can digest it, but we don't see these trends if they play out over centuries the way they have in India and more so than even in the United States with a couple hundred years. So I think, she does some things in the film that I think I've seen the film twice too. That's the other thing. So I've seen how she's underlying and underscoring these points dramatically. And maybe they don't do as good a job as I think, a Talking Heads kind of documentary with some photographs and more theory. But that's a different audience. Again, I think far fewer people are going to see a documentary than a film.
Yep.
And then there's one last thing I'll mention because there's this memory thing, and it played with me as well. But she does sort of recycle the characters. Like her mother and her husband die, but they keep coming back due to the way that the film is edited. And at first I had a problem with it too. I think that's part of the scattershot thing you're talking about.
Right.
And at first I didn't like it, but then there's this one scene. This is a tiny detail, but the night that he dies, they have this argument in the car and they're coming into the house and, they're basically silent. She goes to take a bath and read, and he goes off to he just basically goes off to bed as far as we know. She replays the scene later, and he offers her pasta. And you don't see that in the first time you see that scene, but it's as if, memory is always playing with us a little bit. It's a little bit different. And you're also getting the fuller picture in the second version of the scene. So it's interesting that she replays that scene, and there's this one detail that is wildly different. And it shows that I think they actually even hold hands for a brief moment. Whereas the first scene, they're arguing, and you assume that, the last time she saw him alive, they were kind of mad at each other. She revisits that scene, and honestly, we don't even know if it's true or not, but he offers her pasta. She tells that to her friend, and when she retells the story, and then we re-see the scene right before he dies. And it's just this interesting thing about memory and uncovering truth and being honest about things that I think serves the whole film in a tiny, tiny way. But again, it's not the best way of conveying that theory. But in film, you don't really spell things out. You just have to let things drip, 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 and let the audience take it in. So I think I probably benefit from having seen it twice. And I just thought there were a lot of incredibly moving moments, and I cried a bunch. That stuff with the falling leaves just got me. The Dalit man cleaning the toilet. That is just intense. And it happens sort of intercut a little bit with the swimming pool scene is happening at the same time. So you get this filth scene and this potential cleanliness scene balancing each other out. And it's all done to Spiegel, which is the Arvo Part piece with the piano and the cello. And it's just, there's some really fantastic moments, but I think you have a good point in the sense that there aren't a ton of those moments, and they don't balance out a lot of the other, you called it waffle? I've never used that one before, but
waffle. That's what we call it in Britain. Yeah, waffle. As usual, you have interpreted the film more deeply and more intelligently than I have. As usual, I take my hat off to you.
I don't think that's true. I think it's a challenging film, and I should be challenged for liking it as much as I do. But it's just it's essential viewing for Americans because a lot of people don't get that here, and I don't think they even begin to think that way. So, she's riding that line between something super intellectual, but then in the book, it sounds like it's kind of fluffy or waffly, as you said. So I'm a bit confused too, honestly, because this is not the type of film I normally like. It does feel really like mainstream and broad, but I think it's that way for a reason. And I think I hope it succeeds a little bit more down the line, because I think people need to see it, because I think it does present some pretty intense problems for the United States, a lot of intense issues in a pretty palatable way.
Well, I'm going to do the thing that we always do with these challenging and interesting intellectual films that ask the big questions and really force us to think. I'm going to phone the Cliche Squad.
Cliche Squad.
Because there is no escape. I'm really sorry.
I thought you were going to say we're just going to stop talking about it altogether, which is another option.
I'm going to sick the Cliche Squad on. There's one huge cliche that stood out to me like a sore thumb. Well, that's a cliche, which is, and we've even talked about it recently. This terrible clunking cliche, the coughing cousin. So you see her cough at the end of one scene, and then sure enough, the next time we see the cousin, she is on her deathbed. One cough and you're gone. That's it. The Cliche Squad will be writing up a ticket straight away, and it's a shame, because up till that moment, I thought there was some really impressive storytelling with the cousin. Maybe my favorite bit of storytelling for the whole film, because earlier on, like, she's talking to Isabel on the phone, and the cousin is in the pharmacy, but no one comments on it. She happens to be in the pharmacy. No one kind of makes a thing of it. And then later on, they're having another phone conversation, and you pull back very slightly, and you can just see that the cousin is on dialysis or something like that. She's getting, or maybe chemotherapy, something like that. And no one comments on it. No one says anything about it. It blink and you miss it. And I was thinking, well, this is some really good, nice visual storytelling. Well done. A little bit of background detail, very good. I loved that. Just a little bit of detail for the vigilant. But then they ruin it by having the cousin go cough, 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 cough. Oh, I'm dead. Sorry. Like a school play. I thought that was a real shame.
Well, the look from Isabel in that moment is also the "you're dead" look, or "you're going to be dead soon" look. And sure enough, she dies. Yeah. That is a good one. I will say that we have a new sponsor, and this is timely. I'll just say that this is timely for our new sponsorship. I'm giving a big pass. I think you're right on. I'm glad you spotted that one. I'm saddened by the fact that in Zone of Interest, Nazi was named Hess in the film. He coughed. He was spitting up, and he didn't die to our knowledge. He's dead now.
Incredible.
So maybe we have to balance that against the non-cliche in Zone of Interest.
Yeah, they managed to escape it. There's one other cliche I will point out, which is just, I'm going to call it show and tell. Which is the scene that you referred to just a few minutes ago, where she's thinking back and she tells her friend, he offered me some pasta. Excuse my terrible American pronunciation. But she kind of tells him, when we got back from the house, he offered me some pasta. And then we cut to the scene, and the husband says, "Would you like some pasta?" Like that. You don't need to show me and tell me at the same time. I was paying attention 5 seconds ago when you said about the pasta. So that also just took me right out of the moment, I'm afraid, when I've been told, and then I've been shown again.
And do you think it's an accident that they had lasagna at dinner that night? He says to Isabel, "You should come more often, because we only eat the lasagna when you come," or something like that. So, pasta on the brain.
All those lovely carbohydrates. Oh, you are making me feel hungry. Right. Well, I see exactly what you mean. I think it's an important film, and it has a valuable message. I wish there were more finesse, but finesse is not everything, and perhaps I shouldn't be such a fusspot. Shall we have a break?
We shall.
And have some pasta, and then we'll come back and talk about the film, which I think is a little bit like looking down the telescope from the opposite end at this film, which is Birth of a Nation.
I don't have to tell you, Dr. Rizika, but these past few years have taught us a lot about hygiene, precautions, life, and death. I, for one, never owned or could identify an article of personal protective equipment in BC times. That's before COVID. Until now. Like most, I carried an allegedly clean handkerchief or wore a shirt with 2 sleeves long enough to catch a cough or sneeze. But thanks to the makers of Coffin, I now have all the personal protection I could ever need. Coffin is for those who live and think inside the box. A place where you can also sneeze, cough, and expectorate safely for you and friends, family, even enemies all around you. Okay, so the idea of carrying around a box to cover the noggin while you do your privates sounds cumbersome. Worry no more. Coffin is made of pliable and biodegradable materials. It collapses into a large tote bag. But wait. It also expands into a full body protection unit. Let's face it, sometimes we feel really sick and contagious in all the wrong ways. What better way to recuperate while keeping others safe than stretching out by using the Coffin Plus settings? Just select the Breathe Freely setting and enjoy the best medicine, sleep. Coffin Plus also offers a Breathe Free setting for those seeking affordable end-of-life care. That's right. It's never too early to think about your loved ones. Make their lives easier and safer, even after you're gone. Because it's 100% biodegradable and carbon neutral, Coffin is appropriate for incineration, composting, or for those of you who had water births, you can have it all because water burials are possible to conclude your life's journey. Save on expensive caskets, embalming costs, and handling fees. However, please be careful when choosing between the Breathe Freely and Breathe Free settings. Visit us at coffin.com. That's COFFIN.com, because go figure, someone else already had bought the coughing.com. But we figure it kind of works anyway. Stay out of the coffin or stay in the coffin, but don't cough out or cough all around. And don't cough up a lot for your next coffin. The team at Two Wheel Cinema Club, both those who are medically licensed and those who will not know the difference between cold sores and hot flashes, cannot be legally responsible for listeners' personal health practices. While we may accept compensation for advertising purpose, we simply take the money and run non-profit organizations that better the health and lives of humans everywhere. We do not explicitly endorse the Coffin organization or its operators. Good thing there was a disclaimer at the end.
Now that you're coughing, I'm worried that you're going to be dead in 5 minutes now before the end of the next reel. Seriously, I haven't been coughing for ages. Actually.
I know.
This evening, before we recorded, I managed to inhale half a bottle of ginger beer, and I was coughing like mad before we recorded. I was thinking, oh no, back to my old tricks. But I seem to have somehow managed to swallow it back again. Hello, welcome back to part 2. We are going to be talking about the 1915. Now, I could sort of call it maybe a classic. I'm not sure exactly what the definition of classic is. Yeah. Well-known old film. We'll call it that. The 1915 well-known old film, Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffiths. This was the first 12-reel film. It was a huge 3-hour epic when such things didn't really exist. I think at the time it was kind of a hit. It made a lot of money. I think they screened it with premiere priced tickets. It was a big event. Very early in the history of cinema, and I had never seen it. Had you seen it before?
I had only seen clips, and never seen the whole film. Not at all. I've always been intrigued by it, but I've never seen it, no.
I think I sort of saw like a really short re-edited version many years ago that had a kind of modern soundtrack as a sort of art piece, but I think they compressed it down to 20 minutes or something. Oh, wow. So, I mean, it was just like little clips from. I'd never seen the whole original film, and the whole original film is long, isn't it? I
had it at 3 hours, 13 minutes or something like that, and you said you watched it double time, I guess, doubly fast.
Double time. So I think we both watched it on YouTube, where it is available for free. How is it possible for a 1915 film to be out of copyright? Funny, huh? Yeah. And I am sorry to say I'm a little bit embarrassed, also not embarrassed to say I did make liberal use of the YouTube ×2 speed option. So there are some bits where I did speed up a little bit. I'm sorry. And I think if you dear listener, are considering watching this film,
Yeah.
I would probably recommend you
Yeah.
do the same.
Don't make my mistake. It took me parts of at least 4 nights, maybe 5. I don't even remember. I remember being pretty happy because the last night was only about 25 minutes to go. Yeah, I remember breaking up Jean Dillemont over 3 nights, and I thought that was pathetic. But this is actually 13 minutes longer, and I broke it up over 5 nights. So it's not an easy watch by any means. But you're right, the first 12 reeler. So it's an accomplishment. I think it is like foundational in American cinema in terms of what it did for the technology. I think a lot of advances came through it. It's amazing to think that, you could do a 3-hour film. I think it was shown with an intermission originally, as it should be. But in the silent era, to have a 3-hour and 13-minute film is really, I call it perhaps the first epic film. And I don't know that there might be some films that precede it that are more epic, but it definitely feels big. It's directed by D.W. Griffith, whose name is literally all over the film, right? Every title card has these calligraphic letters spelling Griffith in the top 2 corners and the initials D.W. on the bottom. He's proud to tell you that this is his film.
He is not an Isabel Wilkerson, is he?
No.
He is not a shy, introspective man.
No, he's not. Written by Griffiths with Frank Woods. It's based on a book by the Thomas Dixon Jr. called The Klansman. And I don't think you read The Klansman this time around.
No, I'm happy to say I did not read The Klansman. I'm not tempted
for you. Sounds like poisonous pages to me. Dixon also wrote a book called, and then made a film called The Fall of a Nation, which is interesting because this is the birth of a nation. And I think that's a lost film is what I in my research, it just doesn't exist anymore. So it's obviously been, just lost. The original reels are probably long gone. This, as you said, is available everywhere. It was easy to find on YouTube. In some ways it's worth watching. It's not an easy watch, not an easy viewing, as you can tell, because it took me a long time to get through it. It's based on also, it seems like these blathering boastings and bigoted stories that D.W. Griffith's father told him. He was a Confederate leader in the Civil War. So I think he, heard these memories of his father and nostalgized them all and brought that into the story as well. So you could say it's definitely based on Civil War and the birth of the nation. I think it's the birth of the nation of the Ku Klux Klan. Honestly, it's not the birth of America, clearly. It's what was it called? Semi-fictional? Was that what Origin was? Semi-fictional? Maybe this too could be
docudrama.
Docudrama. This could be characterized in that way as well, perhaps. Let's see. Should we start getting into it a little bit more?
Why don't you tell us? So let's save the listeners 3.25 hours and tell them what is the story of the film.
You're gonna have to stop me or put me on double speed a bunch, because just telling the story will take a little while. But I will try and save you as much trouble as possible. Features Lillian Gish, great actress of the silent age and into this a very long career into the sound age. She had a long career. I think she was in films into her 80s. She's Elsie Stoneman, who's the daughter of Austin Stoneman, who's a powerful U.S. representative, played by Ralph Lewis, and they're also Northern abolitionists, so they're against slavery. Henry Walthall plays Ben Cameron, or as he comes to be known, the Little Colonel, who is a Confederate soldier, and essentially the founder of the white, what did I write? Oh, white shit. I said the word shitty. And then, oops, white sheeted.
the white sheet guys? Is that what you're talking
white
about?
sheeted, not shitty. Sheeted, KKK. God.
Freud would have a field day. Carry on,
Yeah. George Siegman plays Cyrus Lynch, who is of mixed race. They quite freely use the word mulatto throughout the film. They use a lot of bad words in the film, sort of. Lieutenant governor who ends up governing South Carolina for a short spell.
Just calling the guy Silas Lynch,
Yeah.
an on-the-nose name, if ever there was one. I wrote in my notes here, it's like having a character called Jeff Racist.
Yeah.
Or Bernard, People of Colour Are Evil. It's that's the level of title he's got.
Thank you. Yeah, that comes later in my notes. But you cut to the chase.
I'm sorry, I've stolen the punchline already. Continue.
$110,000 budget, which seems crazy to me. I think they figured that's like $2 million now. But some wild opening credits. It says this is an historical presentation of the Civil War and Reconstruction period, and is not meant to reflect on any race or people of today. Which, as you and I both know, that means that it is in fact meant to reflect on people and races of today. That one is followed by another one that says, a plea for the art of the motion picture. We do not fear censorship, for we have no wish to offend with improprieties or obscenities. Yes, they do. See, it's like my brother used to play this thing called Opposite Day, where he would say things and he meant the exact opposite. That's exactly it. We do demand, as a right, the liberty to show the dark side of wrong, and that we may illuminate the bright side of virtue, the same liberty that is conceded to the art of the written word, the art to which we owe the Bible and the works of Shakespeare. We'll come back to the Bible later, I think. I might start with Shakespeare because there's this nod to Shakespeare, and it's a little bit interesting because, one, I think this is a 5-act piece. I don't know if that's really worth anything here. D.W. Griffith thinks of it as I think he breaks it into 2 or 3 parts. The title cards kind of fade away after a little while, but he definitely has at least 2 parts, maybe a 3rd part. We open, and the other thing is that there's a Romeo and Juliet story here, and we'll get to that immediately. But it opens with this title card of Africans brought the sin of disunion to the Union. No context at all that the Africans were brought by violent force and enslaved for more than 250 years, and a majority of Americans despised, and following a certain disunion wrought by stealing land from residents who had been on the continent for at least 20,000 years prior. So it's, they kind of gloss over a lot of the facts of genocide.
There's not enough gloss in the world, is there? Carry on.
So as I said, there's a bit of a Romeo and Juliet vibe here because Austin Stoneman is this powerful abolitionist. He's a U.S. representative from Pennsylvania.
If Romeo and Juliet were both fervent racists.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is that the Northern family isn't racist early on. They're fighting for the Union, but they do become racists because that's what happens, I guess, in the 1860s and Reconstruction thereafter. They are one family in Pennsylvania. Lillian Gish is the eldest daughter, and they have 2 soldier-aged sons. It follows that story in parallel with the Cameron family in Piedmont, South Carolina, headed by a doctor father. He doesn't seem too racist, so James, maybe that could be who you are in Who Am I? He has soldier-aged sons, too. He has a few daughters, and importantly, Ben Cameron, who will be the Confederate soldier known as the Little Colonel. 2 families are sort of joined by romantic liaisons between the sons and daughters, and then in battle, they're sort of divided between Union and Confederate sides. The blacks in South Carolina are shown, surprisingly, mistreating their children and just being terrible citizens in the South. There's blackface everywhere in this film, so you just have to go into that knowing it. It's really obvious, and unsurprisingly, as far as I can tell, and I think I read a little bit about Griffith suggesting that this was true, but the black characters who are closer to the white protagonists are white actors in blackface.
Yeah.
And probably paid more than the many black actors who had minor roles or were extras. And Griffin sort of admitted as much, like on the set, they had to segregate the races and the actors. The unintended irony for me is that the fact that the black characters, I put black in question marks, or black characters committing their horrendous atrocities are actually white people in disguise. And I think it's kind of makes it's an accidental metaphor, I think, but I liked that a lot when I thought about it. Whether in white hood or blackface, it's the whites who are doing the evil, basically. Essentially, Act 1 sets up all the interfamilial romances, the sons of each side and each family going to battle, a ridiculous Abraham Lincoln portrayal setting up the war with his proclamation declaration, And there's this one moment at the end of that first act. It's a reminiscent of the blood flag ceremony and the triumph of the will, because the little colonel sort of waves the Confederate flag over his younger sister Flora to wake her up. So the South has been awakened in its grievances, and they're ready to battle. They're really psyched for the war. So the spoiler bell is, can you spoil a 110-year-old film available for free on YouTube?
Well, neither of us had ever seen it all the way through, so I think it's fair game, actually. It's still spoilable, I reckon.
Fire a rifle. You were talking about rifles earlier. Fire a rifle.
Let's ring the bell. For whom does the bell toll? It tolls for the South or the North, or I don't know, the bad people. That's it. It's on. Okay. Spoil away.
So I think, for me, that's Act 1. Act 2, there are these letters going back and forth, which kind of tell some of the story. Elsie's writing the little colonel, even though I don't think they've ever met. He's constantly looking at her photograph. He's in love with her just on that. So the families are sort of intertwined.
I love that sort of that 1860s version of Tinder.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not that you kind of swipe left or right. It's that you hold a photograph of a woman you've never met next to your heart for like 12 years or something.
Yes. Hope it maybe stops a bullet headed for your heart if necessary. Could help you in battle. A black Union regiment attacks the Cameron house in Piedmont, and they're rescued by Confederates. One of the Cameron sons and a Stoneman son, they meet as enemies. They sort of recognize each other on the battlefield, and then they end up dying together in battle. Griffiths gins up this sympathy for the wealthy Camerons who are having to sell or lose their possessions because of the war. Elsie becomes a Union nurse. The little colonel, who loves Elsie just from that photograph, he's heroically leading this Confederate offensive while also it looks like he saves one of the Stoneman kids, or he saves one Union soldier, and then as a result, he ends up in a Union hospital where, of course, he meets Elsie, and they fall in love properly. So there's a little contrivance there. There are lots of very convenient connections among characters, but I think that's to take this epic story and make it kind of human. So
I have to point out, Elsie she's decided to become a nurse, and as far as I can tell, during the Civil War, being a nurse involved walking up and down the wards playing a banjo.
The banjo, yeah.
That's what she does. Just I think we should bring that back. That's what modern nursing should look like.
Very progressive, musical therapy.
But I promise you, discharge times will speed up massively if there's a woman walking around playing the banjo in the wards. People will pick up their beds and leave immediately.
See, now you have another character you could be during Who Am I? The banjo playing nurse.
Banjo playing nurse.
I call that Act 2. Act 3, the first thing I wrote is the music is great. I don't know if the score was...
that's true. You're right.
I don't know if the score was the same. I mean, the score is modern, I think, because I saw a version where it's a it's a quintet. It's piano, violoncello, trumpet, and clarinet. Now, sadly, you hear a lot of it because it's 3 hours and they repeat a lot of the themes and such. But the music was wonderful, but it's obviously a modern version. It's been pasted onto this YouTube version of the film. But it's great. I would definitely recommend the music. I thought it was fantastic. The evil Union guys who they heal the little colonel because they want to hang him. So get him well so that he can be hanged. But the little colonel's mother appeals to President Lincoln, who appears to just be hanging out in a house next to the clinic. He's really accessible. He was a very accessible president, honest Abraham Lincoln.
And all he appears to do is just mope around, doesn't he? He sits in a chair and just sort of looks at the table constantly until someone comes in and asks him to forgive a soldier.
He signs documents, though, too. I see him signing documents. He offers clemency, so the little colonel's okay. But then Lincoln, of course, will be dead soon because the war ends and John Wilkes Booth kills him in the Ford Theater. This is where Griffith actually says end of act or part 1. He says at the end of part 1. I say it's actually we're already at the end of Act 3 by that point, and I am reducing massively. I think I'm doing a pretty good job.
You are. Condense away.
Let's see. The beginning of Act 4, Reconstruction happens. That's when the South is sort of recovering from the war and sort of under Union rule. Stoneman, the Pennsylvania abolitionist, he hates the idea of clemency for the South, so he sends Lynch to organize the blacks there, which in Griffith's view, organizing the blacks just means convincing them all to stop working, quitting work. The two families are sort of joined together in Piedmont. after the war. And there's a scene where Cameron won't shake hands with Lynch because he's not white. And as a mixed-race character, he sort of becomes the real ultimate bad guy. He's sleazy, he's corrupt, he covets Elsie. He's just, they're demonizing blacks throughout the film. I mean, it's just a terrible portrayal of blacks in the American South after the Civil War. They're not allowed to, now that they're allowed to vote and they can take part in politics, in the House, I guess this would be the South Carolina House, they are raucous, they're unruly, they're stomping, they're eating and dancing in the halls of government. At the end of the act, the little colonel has this light bulb moment when he sees some children hiding under white sheets playing ghosts to scare other kids. He dreams the crystal and clarion origin dream of the white saviors, the Ku Klux Klan. As I said, the nation that I think the title of the film really refers to. And that's the end of Act 4. Greatly reduced for those of you going to watch it. I think follow Jimmy's lead. Double time. Double speed. I'll go to Act 5 and finish up unless you have something that you want to interject right now.
I'm enjoying the synopsis so much that I don't want to put my oar in. Continue.
Taking a lot less time. The little colonel's younger sister, Flora, fetches water, but she's propositioned and pursued by a black Union soldier. She falls to her death trying to escape him, and the colonel gets to her too late, brings her home. They have this dying moment, but she's dead in his arms, and he takes her home. There's a search party for the Union soldier that takes vigilantes to a beer hall run by White Arm Jack. I love this. He's an actor in blackface whose wardrobe must have malfunctioned, so of course his white arm is exposed. So then I guess they just started calling him White Arm Jack. The soldiers hanged. There are these fights that break out. Riots ensue, but fortunately by this point the KKK is pretty well organized, and with their toilet plunger hats, they are a serious force of justice's revenge. Did you see those hats? It's like it's not the classic cape or the hood. A lot of them had these really like hemispheres, and then a long
unicorn hats or something, aren't they?
Yeah, it was wild. Really,
I've got to go back to White Arm Jack there for a minute, because that's like one of the great bits of visual storytelling in the film, isn't it? There's a guy who turns up when they are searching for Gus, who's the guy who has supposedly murdered Elsie by chatting to her being so friendly that she had to throw herself off a cliff.
Yeah.
So the story introduces this guy that we have never seen before, and it tells us that this guy is extremely strong because he arrives carrying an anvil. He's he's kind of nonchalantly just carrying an anvil around, and then he puts the anvil down and he goes and beats up some sort of black soldiers in this bar. And with this kind of it's kind of hilarious fight scene. Really, it's almost like wrestling or something, isn't it?
It is.
It's really kind of crazy fighting. And then at the end of almost every fight, somebody draws a gun and shoots the other guy in the ankles. Yeah, and then they die instantly. That's how all the fights end in the film.
Yeah, it's one man against five, one white man against five black men, or six or more. And some of them are thrown out of the window by anvil-carrying man, and some of them are running out the window or jumping out. And it gets a little comic at that point, which is, this is the age of Chaplin, I suppose. So it's not comic.
But that's probably supposed to be an exciting action scene, isn't it? Not comic at all.
Yeah. So at this time, there's also this sort of parallel story of Lynch is forcing himself on Elsie. He tries to marry her. So you've got these twin stories of non-white men forcing themselves on Aryan women. But have no fear, little Colonel has learned from losing his younger sister. He dons the white robes. He saves his betrothed, on again, off again, sort of betrothed Elsie from the clutches of Lynch. And you mentioned the character's name, so we don't have to talk about it more here. Heroic whites defeat cowardly blacks. Formerly abolitionist stonemans. This is it. There's this switch. They swiftly become racist Confederate sympathizers. There's voter intimidation at the next election to restore the power structure. And Jesus loves white people in the end. There's this bizarre sort of overlay image. These white Southerners are dancing at a ball or something like that, or celebrating, and then there's
in heaven.
Yeah, is that what it is? No, but then there's this massive Jesus sort of hovering over them, approving.
But there's also a kind of hell, isn't there? Though with with a whole great pile of corpses and some guy with an axe at the back of the screen, another giant who's kind of chipping away at something. I didn't kind of understand that, but I think it's
I think there are a couple of moments where I think Griffiths tried to paint this as an anti-war film. It was very strange, and I think there's a title card coming up that sort of gives a little that gives a little bit more. But you've got the blacks dividing Americans in the opening image. Just by their very presence. And then, but their oppression unites the whites and Elsa and the little colonel. Quickly, they move to California somehow. They're on a mountaintop overlooking the Pacific Ocean. This place takes place in South Carolina, but that last image is clearly near the studios in California. And then you figure, that's where their great-great-great-grandchildren's mansion will burn in forest fire or slip on a mudslide and into the sea. But the last card says, Liberty and Union one and inseparable now and forever. And, of course, D.W. Griffith's signature is on it. Yeah. Woo.
Oof.
Yeah. Big film. It's a big film.
It is a big film. I mean, there are huge battles in this film, aren't there? Hundreds of extras, kind of used to look like thousands of people. It was a really big production.
Yeah, big deal.
And from a technical viewpoint, there is a lot of interesting material in this film, like some of the first uses of deep focus, some of the very early compositing of taking one image and playing it against another.
Exactly.
Apparently, the first use of fade outs in a narrative film.
Yep.
So a lot of interesting technical material here that means, well, there's a reason why this has a place in film history.
Yep.
But from a political perspective, should we still be watching it? Maybe not.
No.
It is a historical document, I suppose.
Yeah.
And a fairly terrifying and disgusting historical document of the kind of the mindset of 1915.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that it really deserves to have many copies floating around on YouTube, and I'm not sure I recommend people to watch it because I'm not sure what you would get from it.
Yeah. I think on the top of the version that I watched, it said masterpiece of racist cinema. Which I think sums it up. It's I think I want to talk a little bit about Triumph of the Will because I think it really compares to that as much. So I had a couple thoughts that this is a revisionist piece of history, whereas Triumph of the Will is kind of this anticipatory piece. So it's it's leading up to what's about to happen. It's pre-Holocaust and sort of starting this whole permission structure of segregating and dehumanizing Jewish people in Europe. This is more just revisiting and looking at the Confederate struggle for independence and the Civil War that follows as being a good thing. I saw an interview with D.W. Griffiths who sat down with Walter Houston. It's this sort of staged interview, and he said, the Ku Klux Klan came to being, and that was the right thing at the time. They needed to get control of the South or whatnot. So it's very revisionist as opposed to Triumph of the Will, which is, it's haunting because it's about to happen, but the people even in the film don't really know what's about to happen. Whereas this is just like literally a whitewashing of a certain period of American history.
It's a whitewashing and like a sort of a blackwashing. It's the way that because the film takes its racism into like every possible dimension. Not only are the events on screen racist, but also it's the thing you were talking about how they get important black characters to be played by white actors in blackface.
Yes.
And so the racism continues behind the camera as well. It's racist to 360 degrees. And those people of color who do appear on camera are kind of asked to sort of lampoon themselves in the basest possible way. It's really unbelievable. I'd be interested to go back and ask what those actors of color who appeared in the film felt about what they were doing.
Yeah.
Whether it was that one of those days where, well, a gig's a gig. I mean, I'd be interested to know what they felt about it.
I had the same question. And I'm sure they were paid something, right? I mean, there must, I don't know if this is probably pre-union at that point, but there must have been some payment for being an extra. But obviously you couldn't get one of the bigger roles. There might be one or two black actors that sneak into some bigger roles in this film, but most of those ones that are close to the white actors are in blackface. They are white actors in blackface. I was going to say also that this is Triumph of the Will is similar to this film, and I think that both of these films clearly put the filmmakers on the wrong side of history. And it was funny watching that interview with Griffiths because he, it was close enough after. It must have been 1925, 1930 interview or something like that. It was close enough after where he still felt like he was doing a great service to the American public by releasing the film. But so wrong. Both of them, both films are just so, they're accurate. I think as historical documents, they're really important, but they both really show poor judgment on the filmmakers' parts. That's polite. Or maybe that's too polite.
I think these, the two films this week, it's a very interesting juxtaposition. I do have a few things to say about the way that these two films clash up against each other. But before we get to that bit of the podcast, we're forced to play what this week is my least favourite game. I'm going to force you to play Who Am I out of all the people that I really don't want to be in these two films.
Who am I?
I gave you a couple options. The banjo-playing nurse.
You did. I'm going to grab them with both hands.
And then the less racist doctor from the South.
Well, 2 weeks ago, you got away with saying you wanted to be the dog. So I would like to, there are some cute puppies at the beginning of Birth of a Nation. And if possible, I would like to be one of those cute puppies or maybe a cat. But if that's not allowed, there are two people I thought, well, okay, I could bear to step into his shoes. One of them is there's a Confederate soldier who's like this guy, this background actor who's always guarding the hospital in Birth of a Nation. And every time Lillian Gish walks past him, he sighs deeply. And I thought, yeah, I could see that.
I think that was a Union soldier, actually, because I felt like that was a Union hospital.
Alternatively, in those same scenes, there is an army surgeon.
Oh, yeah, good.
Whose job, it seems to be, is to walk up and down the wards doing nothing.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I could probably do that, I could probably do that. So I would opt to be the army surgeon who does nothing except wear a waistcoat and walk up and down.
Good work if you can get it.
Who are you with from these two films this week?
Well, similarly, I'm looking for good work too. I went right to origin. I feel this is not more who am I, but who do I want to be? I liked Amari Selvin, the handsome gentleman. He's always dressed in tuxedos. He's a New York Times editor who finds the right people for the right cause and the right assignment. But his job is seemingly to attend fabulous lectures and parties. Very well dressed. That's me, at least in my dream world avatar life.
That's you in the real world. You're always wearing a tuxedo.
Played by Blair Underwood.
I have to prize you out of a party every week for this podcast.
Very suave. But so I went to Origin instead. I do like the literary aspect of his job, but I also like just the nicely dressed and at the right places with the right people all the time.
That's a good gig. Why did we go into journalism? We should have done that. We should have done that. Right. Well, let's do our synthesis then. We'll bring the two films together and see whether we can enlighten ourselves a little bit.
Yeah.
About some blooming awful stuff. So I wrote in my notes, these are two films about racism told from opposing perspectives. So it is, we have the telescope of racism, and while Birth of a Nation is looking from one end of the telescope, Origin is looking from the other. And so, you get to see it from both ways. What surprised me about the kind of the parallels between, or about the film, right, is the parallels between the Confederacy and Nazi Germany. So, I mean, you talked about how Triumph of the Will was kind of reminiscent of Birth of a Nation. But what's interesting to me, I thought, is that like the main thesis of Origin, like it's one big idea that it prosecutes with real conviction, is this notion that the Americans provided the inspiration for the Nazis in creating their race laws. And yet, this big idea is actually right there in a film from 109 years ago. So like the Confederates in The Birth of a Nation, like you were saying, they worship the flag, just like the Nazis did in Triumph of the Will. They call for, I wrote this in my quotes, victory or death. They're obsessed with purity of blood. They even talk about their Aryan birthright. It's so much so that I was wondering how much of an influence Birth of a Nation had on the birth of Nazism.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure that film would have made it over to Germany before 1920. So I thought it was very interesting that the thing which lies at the very crux of the Isabel Wilkerson book is right there in Birth of a Nation, ready to be seen 109 years ago.
Yep. And I think that's why the films work well together, because Birth of a Nation essentially supports her thesis, doesn't it? It's like, that's it right there.
It does.
And, she talks exclusively about the United States, Germany, and India, right? In that film. That's it.
Yeah.
Those are her example cases, I guess.
Yeah, her 3 touchstones.
And I think for me, I've kind of pre-synthesized, because I think I've already talked about these things, but that's the Nazis were just this one generation ultimately doing a lot of damage to a targeted group of people. But I don't think the Germans, it wasn't passed down to the next generations in the same way. I mean, again, I won't argue that there are no Nazis anymore, but and even in Origin, they sort of make that point, like having outlawed things, having really acknowledged. We saw this in Zone of Interest, acknowledging and keeping the past as something to remember. Whereas here we've got a lot of denial, and I think that's what the contrast really is, the denial that we're still seeing in the United States, that I think DuVernay exploits a little bit, or exposes a little bit in Origin. And then for me, there's the memory theme, which I think is pretty important in both films. Like, Griffiths is making this entire history from his childhood memories. It's 40-something years after Reconstruction, right? 44, 45, 50 years after Reconstruction. So I think...
So it's living memory.
So it's, and it's based on the Klansmen, which I don't want to know anything about the Klansmen. But so, I mean, the source material there is, it's suspect, I guess. But it also lends into that idea that it's not, at least in American history, it's not one bad player or even one generation of bad players. It's generations after generations enslaving and committing genocide, if you're talking about the American Indian population or the indigenous people. So it's generations of people not questioning evil in their lives and then sort of perpetuating it. And I think you see that in Birth of a Nation for sure. And it's unacknowledged, I think, in Origins. But I think there's some good points. These are both, I mean, Origins could end up being, a decent historical document as well. Yeah,
you're right. Yeah.
I agree with you. I think there needs to be a documentary, and maybe just something that's a bit more focused on the material and maybe less on the forced protagonist.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I do agree.
But Birth of a Nation is, it has this, it's an historical record, but it definitely tries to be dramatic, right? I mean, as I said, there's very real act structure there. He is, ironically, there's a little borrowing from Shakespeare, and he focuses on a couple families, which is a wise decision, and Origin does that as well. You're focusing on sort of one family and how they go through the American experiment, and the same thing's happening in Birth of a Nation. So they definitely try to dramatize some historical facts.
There was kind of something else about these two films that underlined the themes that we talked about kind of last week, which is just that extremist politics really lean in on symbols and iconography and costumes, and and graphic design. That's really important for extremist politics, isn't it?
Yep.
It's like there are ways to control people, and some of them are just to do with easily recognizable and drawn symbols, outlandish costumes. It's a way of controlling people. Yeah. And we see that with the Nazis. We see that with the KKK. You do have to ask yourself, if you look at yourself in the mirror and you realize that you have to use a disguise to cover your whole body and go around holding a burning cross, if you need that kind of graphic design to represent yourself, maybe there's something that's not compelling enough about the ideology on its own.
Yeah.
Try to appeal to people on the basis of ideas rather than just bold, crazy costumes with a horn sticking off your head.
Yeah, symbolism and iconography, which is more attractive than the truth. I think that's the troubling thing, is like you can get people interested in those movements based on the iconography, but then trying to get people to open their eyes to the evils of that is a much harder job.
I don't want to sound excessively political, but is there an element of the Make America Great Again red baseball cap in some of this? Does that not borrow a little bit of this notion of bold iconography to further extremist politics?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, just the slogan, Make America Great Again, it suggests that there's something maybe in that time, 1915, or for a lot of Americans to this day, during the time of Civil War, or the time of slavery, that was a greater time than we're in right now. I don't know when they're talking about. When was America great that they want to make it that time again? So, yes, the answer is yes, absolutely.
Well, with those cheery thoughts in mind, should we talk about what else has been playing at the theatre?
Yes.
Have you been watching any other Nazi-based films, maybe?
Yeah, I think we're moving on. I think, I think we're ready. We've had a month of this, so maybe it's time to
let's move. We got to move on.
I've seen 2 documentaries about artists whose names start with A, and that's the title of the film in both cases. It's Anselm. I'll keep it German for a moment.
Okay, right.
Anselm's, I forget his last name. I should look it up quickly, but he's a German-born artist. I think he lives in France. I think he's back in Germany. It's a Wim Wenders documentary.
Oh.
And it shows his work and this sort of campus he's built. I think it's in France, where he's just taken this old factory and he's turned it into his artwork. And it's kind of some wild artwork. He does these very, very large scale paintings where he's burning grass onto canvas and then painting over it. It's pretty wild, and it does, it's I guess it is kind of a Nazi film, because he's basically questioning German history, and he's got these fields of wheat and grass that actually look like cemeteries, and so I think he started doing stuff in the late 60s, and he's still alive, and that was worthwhile. I think it's an interesting documentary. Didn't have as much detail on his life and why he does what he does, as much as just kind of showing it. So it was a very Wim Wenders artsy documentary.
Right, okay.
And then another one was Ailey, the American choreographer and dancer Alvin Ailey. So it's a biography I should say a documentary about his life, and far more biographical, with lots of footage of him choreographing and dancing, and what his company is still doing today. And it was playing because I think later in the spring, the Alvin Ailey company is coming here to do a performance. So there was sort of a setup for that. So a couple of art documentaries on my side. How about you?
As usual, nowhere near as intellectual from my end. I watched. I had a few days off this week, so I watched The Endless. It's I love low budget science fiction.
Yeah.
This is a low budget 2017 science fiction film. I think there's something about low budget sci-fi, which means you have to come up with interesting ideas, because you can't afford to pay for any big effects.
Of course.
So it's all based on ideas. It's made by this kind of pair of friends, Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead. It might be Aaron Moorhead. I don't know how you pronounce it in America. Mm-hmm. But between them, they directed it, they wrote it, they produced it, they shot it, they acted in it.
Yeah.
So they kind of did everything, these two guys, and it's good fun.
Huh.
They play these two brothers who have escaped like a strange cult, and one of them wants to go back and one of them doesn't. So they agree to return to the cult, who live out in the desert for one day, to prove to the younger brother that it wasn't this great life that he remembers, that it was dreadful. So they drive out to this weird kind of deserty cult, but everyone is kind of a bit weird, and the whole story slowly gets weirder and weirder. It's just really good fun. You can tell it's low budget, and they have wrung the absolute maximum they can out of their micro budget. It's good fun.
Oh, wow.
I'd really recommend it. And the brothers, they've gone on to do some stuff for Disney TV, so they have gone on to slightly bigger budget material.
Good. I like that. I mean, I agree with you 100% that the low budget stuff tends to be more imaginative, and they're getting more out of their story as opposed to their effects. So right on. Yeah.
I got to the end of it and I kind of thought, I should write a film like that because it's really cheap to do and it's just cute and fun. You just you sprinkle a few actors out in the desert and you just go with ideas more than effects. So yeah, good fun. Just time to do the socials. On Instagram, we are at 2 Real Cinema Club. You can read the blog at 2realcinemaclub.com, comment on our YouTube channel, or email us at 2realcinemaclub@gmail.com. Tell your friends about us. Leave us a review if you can. It helps us out, and you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, iHeartRadio, wherever else you get your podcasts. Next time, what are we doing next? Well, next time we're going to meet to the popcorn counter, but the week after that, what are we doing then?
We are going back to school and learning about anatomy. I got to talk to the anatomy teacher at school to figure out what I'm supposed to do.
I really ought to know some of that, shouldn't I? It'd be good if I knew a bit.
We'll be leaning on your knowledge heavily for this. We're going to look at Anatomy of a Fall, which is 2023.
Yeah.
I want to say Denmark. Is that a Danish film?
Oh, I don't even know.
It's one of these multi-European country pieces. But it was, I think, the Danish entry for the best film at the Oscars. And we're going to compare that to Anatomy of a Murder.
James Stewart.
Stewart. And was that
looking forward to that.
I want to say like 1957 or something, but I won't go on the record. I'll just say it on the podcast. Anyway, we're going to see that film too. So a lot of anatomy, one of a fall, one of a murder. I'm curious to see, I think they're both courtroom heavy, and I'm curious to see if there's some reason Anatomy of a Fall is called Anatomy of a Fall, if they take anything from Anatomy of a Murder. So we'll find out in a few weeks.
Is it possible that old films and new films are somehow related? Is that possible?
Yes.
Someone should do a podcast about that. That's a really good idea. Right, let's see you next week. We'll go and see the film.
Yeah. All right. Let's go, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.